Hello and thank you for joining us today. I'm Paul Stover, President of the OC Forum, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to providing a civil public space focused on events that impact our community. Our goal is to facilitate extraordinary programs with visionaries, connections, conversations, and solutions. On behalf of the entire OC Forum Board, we'd like to thank you for joining us for the Future of virtual program series made possible by presenting sponsors UCI and UCI Health. With the support of all our generous sponsors and viewers like you, the OC Forum has been able to provide great virtual conversations with completely open access to the entire community. If you are able, we would appreciate your donation or membership so that we may continue to provide these timely programs. We look forward to your continued partnership as we celebrate the OC Forum's 30th anniversary throughout the year. Because without your support, our public service programming simply would not be possible. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy today's program. And don't forget to have a great OC Day.
At UCI, we believe in the infinitely curious. We believe in the courageous of thought, the ones willing to fail again and again until one day they don't. When you have the courage to see things differently, to see opportunity where others see impossibility, amazing things will happen. At UCI, we stop at nothing to change the world, to save lives and deliver the extraordinary.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our election special program on the future of affirmative action presented by UCI and UCI Health today. My name is Carolyn Cavecci. I serve as the CEO and President of the Orange County Taxpayers Association, and I am going to be your moderator for today's discussion. Affirmative action has actually a very rich and long history in our state in California. Prop 209, which was passed in 1996 and was modeled actually on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, was passed again in 1996. They called it the California Civil Rights Initiative, and it banned discrimination or preferential treatment that uses a person or a person's race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, public education, or public contracting. It passed with a 55% vote, and California was actually the first state to ban what was called affirmative action at that point. Prop 16 is on the ballot this November, and it is going to repeal Proposition 209. But before we get to Proposition 16, I would like to introduce our panelists that we have with us today. First is Vincent Pan. He is the co-executive action. Vincent, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. And we also have Dr. Richard Sander, who is a distinguished professor of law at UCLA. And, Dr. Sanders, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. I did a little research on affirmative action. It's interesting to kind of go back to the 1960s, my era when I was growing up. And President Kennedy did an executive order back in 1961, and it used affirmative action, I believe, for the first time. And it instructed federal contractors to take affirmative action to assure that applicants were treated equally without regard to race or color or religion or sex or national origin, kind of a flip on what we consider affirmative action today. And then we obviously went into the mid-60s and the civil rights. So my question to you is, one of the terms in Prop 16 talks about that they want to reapply this within the guidelines of federal law. So could you kind of walk us through affirmative action meant the opposite back in the 60s originally than we consider it now. And when they talk about within the limits of federal law, what are they talking about? Where is federal law now on this?
Well, it's a bit of a tangle, but I think the broad outlines are that, uh, as you mentioned, when Kennedy started these affirmative action programs, the idea was to level the playing field, to get rid of old boy networks and try to reform processes, outreach processes, and selection processes, so that new rising demographic groups would have the same chance as the old established groups. In the it was around 1968 that that universities started using outright preferences because they were finding that just leveling the playing field didn't solve the problem of underrepresentation, and they didn't want to wait decades for the pipeline to be fixed, so they sort of jumped the queue and gave preferential treatment to African Americans in particular, but eventually some other minority groups too. These initiatives spread to employment areas and contracting areas, and there have been probably a dozen Supreme Court decisions that have dealt with the proper scope of racial preferences. And outside the area of education, these have been narrowed quite a bit. So, for example, a Croson decision in the early 90s held that Richmond, Virginia could not use preferential treatment for African Americans in contracting, partly because Richmond had a very significant Black presence in its city council, and they thought that that was actually sort of an insider preferential treatment rather than an objective treatment of disadvantage. There have been, I think, 5 Supreme Court decisions on the use of preferences in higher education. And the funny thing about them is that they seem to significantly restrict what schools can do. They've said that you can't have quotas. They've said that you can't give a certain number of points based on race or other protected characteristics. That you can't have race be the predominating factor in making a decision. But the difficulty is that none of these decisions lay out any concrete criteria for actually implementing those. So what you find is that when you examine what schools are doing today outside of California, they're sort of only nominally complying with federal law. They're using a lot of discretion in how they grant preferences. They still often do have very large preferences. They have things that look very close to formulas. They have things that look very close to quotas. So we have this structure of regulations from the courts, but there's very little oversight. And so people like me tend to think that those restrictions are more words than actual effective restrictions.
Well, and the courts have ruled that quota systems are unlawful, and especially with education, as you just said. And we can talk about business and employment and the impact in just a little bit. But Vincent, with that with those rulings already in place, how do you see this kind of new movement back to affirmative, what they're calling affirmative action now? How do you see that colleges applying that?
Well, let me go back just a little bit on the history, because I think what Rick laid out is really important, and what you did as well. That affirmative action was always designed to fight discrimination, and to the extent that race and gender would be considered, it was always to fight existing discrimination against the backdrop of a status quo, which I think we can all agree now, looking back 50, 60, 70 years, was very unfair to people of color and to women. The organization I lead, Chinese for Affirmative Action, was founded in 1969, and some of our early work involved exactly that. So, for example, suing the police department when in a very large city with a very large Asian population, there were no Asian police officers. Suing the school district when they would not teach kids who didn't speak English. They would just sort of pass them along and not make any effort to teach English language learners. And that work has continued. And I think the fundamental premise is that in order to address real discrimination, you have to identify and address these disparities. So fast forward to today, the federal courts have made it more constrictive. I think the degree to which any college or university is abiding by those is probably a subject of a case-by-case analysis. And I don't think that anyone wants to see discrimination against different groups of folks. And at the same time, I think most folks do value the importance of diversity. And so it's created this very difficult window where we want the benefits of diversity, we want the benefits of a more level playing field, we want the benefits of inclusion, but sometimes we're very constrained in terms of the policy measures to be able to do that. And so our argument with Proposition 16 is at least ending the ban on affirmative action, race and gender conscious affirmative action. We are better off doing that and being able to pursue narrowly tailored programs to address very specific disparities that we still have.
Well, I think the difference, we're talking about the difference between discrimination and quotas, and is there a middle ground someplace that as a society, we can kind of step in? The courts have been pretty firm on what they allow and what they don't allow. So for either one of you, where are we as a society now? I know, Vincent, that's what you're working at, but where are we clearly in the 2020? Where are we as a society as far as a level playing field? And have we achieved that level playing field where, depending on, doesn't matter what your race or your gender is, you're able to move forward successfully, whatever that looks like for you in life?
Well,
I think.
Someone
Go ahead, Vincent. I can go second.
Well, what I was going to say is, at CAA over the last 8 months, we've received over 2,500 reports of hate incidents against Asian Americans. We get hate mail all the time, people saying go back to China, saying you all eat bats. And there's a direct association between that rise in hate incidents with how oftentimes the coronavirus is described and how people perceive this. And so this is one way, at least for CAA, we know that racism is alive and well. And these are incidents where kids are being spat on, elderly folks who are being pushed in stores. And then I think we see it in other parts of society too. Obviously, the movement for Black Lives and the murder of George Floyd raised the national consciousness on how disparities in law enforcement are matters of life and death. The Me Too movement sort of exposed in a different way how sexual harassment still is much, much too widespread in many workplaces, especially where men hold a lot of power. So I think overall, society knows that we have to do a lot better. I think the more difficult question is, how do we do that? I think it's in our view, we are better off being proactive, being affirmative, to try and remedy these things rather than sit back and hope that simply, declaring that policies have to be colorblind or gender blind will get the job done.
So I think we need to be very cautious. My view is we have to be very cautious before we allow state actors, state and local actors across the board to have this power to discriminate based on race. And therefore we want to look and see, what did Prop 209 do? How have we managed an environment that forbade those types of preferences and discrimination? And a lot of the discussion about Prop 16 has focused on the University of California. So let me just briefly explain what happened there. The University of California used very large racial preferences until Prop 209 was passed. They did not do much in the way of outreach. So Blacks and Hispanics were present at the university, but their numbers were modest and they were very flat over time. They weren't growing as the population changed. When Prop 209 passed, it really shook the university. There was a lot of prediction that it would have a devastating impact upon minority enrollment. And the university convened groups, some of which I sat on, to try to think of proactive ways to do affirmative action that didn't involve preferences and discrimination. And what they came up with was a whole program of outreach and using socioeconomic preferences, thinking about people's individual disadvantages, forming partnerships between UC schools and high schools. And collectively, this had a transformative effect on the university. it was an effect at two different levels. One is that it really improved the pipeline so that Blacks and Hispanics applied in much larger numbers, and enrollment of both African Americans and Hispanics increased dramatically after Prop 209. It's doubled for African Americans, and it's something like quadrupled for Hispanics. And then it also improved their performance, because a big problem with preference is that it sometimes puts students into academic environments where they can't compete effectively. And that then has a very harmful effect upon their ability to complete difficult majors or their ability to graduate at all. And we saw that at UC. We saw that after preferences were removed, outcomes improved very sharply for both Blacks and Hispanics, especially Blacks. And we have a much higher number of graduates. The percentage of graduates is much higher. The percentage of students persisting in science fields is much higher. I really can't find any outcome at the UC that is not consistent with a success story.
So Vincent, do you think legislating affirmative action actually will give everyone more of a level playing field going forward?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think the things that Rick mentioned could still continue. That there's nothing in Prop 16 that would limit the ongoing use of race and gender neutral programs, whether that's outreach or retention, etc. But I do think that what Prop 16 does do, it does give us another tool in the tool belt, one that must be used judiciously and within the confines of all the other existing laws. But I don't think we should equate affirmative action with discrimination. In our view, it's a much more direct way at getting at some of the root problems that we see without needing to find so-called proxies. So for example, it's worth noting that affirmative action in California is completely legal in the private sector. And so for a group like the OC Forum, if the entire board or staff were all men, you would say, well, this isn't going to be good for our organization and what we're trying to achieve. We should try to make sure we have more women. You wouldn't try to find proxies for women. You would just say, let's do that. And you wouldn't think of that as like discriminating against men. So I think similarly in different parts of our public sector, there are still areas where there are major imbalances. If we look at UC, for example, in its contracting, prior to Proposition 209, the contracts, about 10% went to companies owned by women and people of color, and that's dropped now, I think, to around 2%. When we look at the faculty at UC, the tenured faculty, I think about 70% are still men. So which is not to argue against the ability of race and gender neutral programs that Rick has mentioned from being effective. But in our view, they're too slow and they're too insubstantial.
So the problem, if I could just jump in, is that when you have when you think of it in terms of those percentages, the way that translates into decision making really does lead to quotas, or even worse than quotas. So Vincent points out that the percentage of UC faculty is 70% male, but that's a body of faculty that's been assembled over the last 40 years. I've been at UC for 31 years. You want to look at the marginal rate of hiring, and if you look at new hires over the last 5 years, you see that has a pretty good gender balance and a pretty good racial balance. And if you further then look at the source fields that we can draw upon, if you look at who's completing PhDs in different fields, you see that Blacks, Hispanics, and women are all overrepresented relative to their presence in those pools. So what that means is that at UC, we are already in effect using preferences. And I think most people within UC would concede that exists. They're strictly going beyond the spirit of Prop 209, but we're bending things in that direction. So if you pass Prop 16, then there becomes this tremendous pressure to eliminate anything that looks like a surface underrepresentation, whether it's in admissions or faculty or contracting, and then that creates something worse than quotas. You just get you get bidding wars for these very scarce people who have the desired complexion or gender in a particular field, and qualifications go out the window. you go back very quickly to a system where you've got dramatic disparities in qualifications between people in different groups. And that's clearly what we don't want. I'm sure that Vincent doesn't want that. And what we have now is a system where there is, in fact, a thumb on the scale, but it's not something that leads qualifications to disappear. So more broadly, Carolyn, I think when you think about the level playing field question, it's so important to think about what is the pool from which we're drawing from. Is this a problem of how we're recruiting people from the available pool, or is it a pipeline problem? There's still very significant pipeline problems in sort of increasing the number of Hispanic high school graduates, increasing the number of blacks who get good grades in school, increasing the number of women who get science PhDs. Those are all pipeline issues. You can't solve them by simply decreeing that, well, we're gonna require the schools to have certain percentage outcomes in their hiring and their admissions.
You know, it's interesting, my husband and I were having that conversation last night when we were talking about, what is the solution to this? He jokingly said, it'd be interesting if the NFL and the NBA actually had quotas on who they hired on their teams. We'd be looking at a much different professional sports teams. And we actually kind of went back to, we brought it all the way back as well to, where are the real problems in California, specifically with the education system? And Vincent, I'm curious, a lot of people look at affirmative action as reverse discrimination, but you obviously don't feel that way. So in a perfect world for you, what would the solution to this be? Would you take it all the way back to the education system and try to make changes to that? Or do you think putting in, in a way, not really quotas because you can't do that, but changing the hiring processes of companies or admissions to colleges is the way to go? What's your perfect solution?
Well, I think that the perfect solution has to include some ability to acknowledge that race and gender matter, and to give policymakers tools to be able to do that. I think that the question of whether it's a pipeline issue or a pool issue, it's both. And so I think one of the things about Prop 16 that's important to know, it lifts the ban on affirmative action, not just in university admissions, but in K through 12 education as well. So what would be the impact of passing Prop 16 in a K through 12 system? Here's like one example. We could probably better target our resources so that the groups that are not doing well can do better. We could look at the fact that about 3/4 of our K through 12 students are students of color, but only about 1/3 of the teachers are people of color. There's plenty of research that suggests that students do better when they have instructors from backgrounds that are similar as well as dissimilar. I think that even people's health outcomes and their ability to get out of poverty and to have economic sustainability. The ban on affirmative action that Prop 209 presented led to a decrease of about $1.2 billion a year from companies that were owned by women and people of color. So you think about how that money back into communities, not just businesses, but back into communities that have been struggling can make a difference. And I think that would help address the pipeline that Rick has identified, while also I think, at the same time, making sure we're doing everything we can to not miss qualified people already in the pool.
Richard, go ahead, Richard. I'm curious to see what your perfect world looks like to solve this. If you do think there is a problem.
There definitely is a problem, and there definitely is not a perfect world, but something that we can do that's very fundamental that moves us in the right direction is lowering housing segregation. Segregation is the root of a lot of these different problems. And, there's been an excellent amount of research in the last 10 or 15 years on the role of segregation. And California's played an important role in this because we have a couple metropolitan areas, San Diego and Sacramento, which are both pretty big metro areas, and they have unusually low levels of black segregation. And what you find nationwide is that every time segregation falls below a certain level, you get really large black gains across the board in health outcomes, in employment, in income, and in test scores. So dealing with housing segregation is a way of really making dramatic improvements in the pipeline. If you lower segregation by about 20 or 30%, you shrink the black-white gap in almost any area that you look at between 50 and 70%. You get these really disproportionate benefits, and there are strategies that can help deal with housing segregation. The problem with preferences as a solution to the pipeline is that I think it actually cuts the other way. It aggravates the problem. Let me just give you a concrete example. I mentioned before that before Prop 209, a lot of the students admitted with large preferences struggled to complete science majors. That's a big problem nationwide. African Americans, relative to their numbers, are about 1/7 as likely to get a PhD in STEM fields as whites are, even though blacks have the same interest in sciences when they finish high school. And several studies have directly shown that this is linked to the use of large preferences, which lead African Americans who go to college to drop out of STEM fields because the large preferences put them into an unviable competitive situation. At UC, the persistence in STEM fields increased dramatically after Prop 209, cutting directly against national trends. And our PhD programs also produced many more Black and Hispanic STEM graduates. We've had growth that really hasn't been duplicated anywhere else in the country. And I think it's because of our race neutrality. So race neutrality has ironically really improved that pipeline, so that if you had this example being followed in more jurisdictions, we'd have much less of a shortage of Black and Hispanic PhDs in science. So I think you want to focus on real solutions to problems like addressing housing segregation, and not Band-Aid solutions that aggravate the problem, like large preferences.
I just want to take a real quick break and remind all of our viewers that you can submit questions in the comments section, and we're going to get to some questions from our viewers a little bit later in the program. But please go ahead and submit your questions in the comments section, so we have people monitoring that, and we will get to them. I was born in 1960. I'll just put it out there. So I have memories in growing up in Southern California, in Los Angeles and Orange County area of massive problems in the 60s, and then again, with the Rodney King trial and the outcomes of that. We're seeing something again in our nation, and in areas that I think are where you wouldn't think about problems. Are you both kind of feeling, and I'll just be honest, I'm feeling like our country's at a real turning point, and there's so much anger on both sides, and I'm seeing such ugliness in literally on both sides, politically of the aisle and culturally in the communities of our nation. I'm white, I'm female, I can't be the only person. I know I'm not the only person. So could you both spend some time and talk to me about how you're feeling right now as far as I'm going to call it unrest in our country, and if you feel that that's a positive or a negative as far as going forward and allowing underrepresented communities to prosper and to do well in jobs and education as well. So Vincent, can we start with you with that one? How are you seeing what's happening right now?
Well, thank you for sharing, and I'll say, in some ways, the moment of reckoning that we are in has been, the challenge for this country since its founding. And our country was set up in a way where it had very lofty ideals around equality for everyone, but in practice was enslaving people and relegating others to second-class humanity or citizenship. And so the whole struggle of this country is to try and live up to the promise of equality for everyone. And I think there's been times where we've moved forward and gotten resistance, and then moved backwards and come full circle to push again. And I think that's where we are right now. I think that one way that I can kind of relate this back to what we can do about it, though. I think that for the most part, especially in California California. People do want to solve these problems. They don't want the division. They don't want the unrest. But it's important to understand that unless we fix the problems, there will be ongoing dissatisfaction, protests, unrest. So if you take, for example, the issue of police violence, I don't think any decent human being wants to look at an unarmed man have their life snuffed out of them with a knee on their neck. I don't think any of us want to see that. But we have to recognize that in many areas of law enforcement, the police officers don't reflect the community at all. And so for something like Prop 16, it would allow us to at least look at that and say, does it make sense if you have, and I'll take an extreme example, a police department that's 90% white in a community that's 90% black? Is that not going to present some problems? It's going to present problems. I was on the police commission in San Francisco. Even basic issues of how we're able to better line up our beat officers so that they can be in communities that they come from. All of those would be red flags because of Proposition 209. So I do think that there's many, many ways that as a society we can move forward, but it's a real, moment of reckoning on how and whether we will do that, starting from the top of the ticket. We're here to talk about Proposition 16, but this is also, a national issue. I certainly believe that California ought to be leading the way and doing everything we can from a public policy standpoint to address these disparities that then lead to inequities that then lead to unrest.
So for me, I spend most of my working time dealing with research and program development, program evaluation in the area of racial inequality. So for someone like me, the events in June are very exciting in the sense that it's like, okay, wow, issues that I care about are now kind of dominating the national conversation. But I've had such mixed feelings because so much of the energy around the protests and so much of the energy that's followed seems to me to either not articulate concrete solutions or talk about things that I think are potentially counterproductive. There's a lot and lots and lots of discussion about, let's increase representation in this field and let's increase representation here. And very little about, so let's figure out what the real driver of inequality is. Housing segregation, for example, and let's do something about that. I can tell you that there's been very little movement in the field of housing segregation since this all happened. I mean, there are a few new initiatives, but it's such an opportunity to focus attention on that fundamental problem. So I think if you, for example, took the 20 million or so that the Yes campaign is spending on Prop 16, that would be enough money to fund a really important anti-segregation initiative in California. And there's nothing happening like that. I don't agree with Vincent that we need Prop 16 to fix problems like the makeup of police forces. And I say that because although it's undoubtedly true that there are police forces that don't have adequate minority representation, I would assume that that's because the leadership of those forces is not committed to diversity. What's so clear from the UC example is that if the desire for diversity exists, then race-neutral methods of healing that problem, of addressing that problem, are very available. And I think the Prop 16 campaign has not done a good job of articulating specific examples where there are leaders who are saying, well, I would be here instead of here if I had this extra tool in my pack, and let me show you the track record of what we try to do. I think everywhere you look at specific track records of leaders who are trying to fix these problems, they've managed fine with race-neutral strategies. On the contrary, if you look at other states or even parts of the UC system that are violating Prop 209, what you see very consistently is anti-Asian discrimination in higher education. And that's a really serious problem. That's something that's going to accentuate division and not heal it. So again, it's a counterproductive strategy, not a real solution.
Vincent, why do, you're very much, let's switch right over to Prop 16. We're going to know in less than a week whether this passes or not. You obviously feel it's needed. Rick doesn't. So why do you think Prop 16 is going to solve some of the problems that Rick's articulated?
Well, I don't think it will solve all of the problems, but I do think it's a necessary part of the solution, even in areas of housing segregation, actually. I think the ability to have more race-conscious programs would help. I think in practice, what we see is that many general councils, school districts, local government, transportation agencies, those who don't want and are not committed to diversity, use 209 as an excuse to not even explore how disparities may be at work. So that's one. I think like what happens when you pass Prop 16, then leadership can start to ask the important questions. And oftentimes, because of the way the Supreme Court has ruled, the solutions may very well be race neutral. They may very well be gender neutral. And in fact, the way the Supreme Court has ruled, those neutral solutions must be pursued first. And so I think what Rick is suggesting would have to happen basically against the law, like that somehow that's going to be abused. By eliminating the ban, it does not create a mandate. It does trust our local government. It does trust our local school districts, our transportation agencies, our public colleges and universities to come up with solutions to specific problems in their areas. That the demographics of Orange County are very different from the demographics of, San Francisco. The disparities that different groups may face will look different in different places. But we know they are there, right? And we know that we should be doing more about that.
And the demographics is interesting. I think there's this impression that Orange County is still this, bastion of white, upper middle class suburbia, and it really we're very changing. We're changing in political registration. This is a county now that swings Dem in our national races. And in even different communities, the racial makeup now has changed quite a bit since when I grew up here in the 1960s. My concern is that I worry that culturally we're at a nation that just isn't going to want to solve these problems. That we're still a nation that is, at odds with each other on this, and aren't going to be able to come to the table to achieve that. And I don't know that an affirmative action or a Prop 16, I don't know that will solve this. So Vincent, I guess my question for you then is, it's probably the question nobody can answer. How do you start to change culture? We've come a long way since the 17 and the 1800s, but we're not there yet. Do you really think then that a Prop 16 is a good first step for this? You've said that, and maybe you can just articulate a little bit more. Right. I worry that this is a society that's just not going to be, not only are we not going to be accepting of it, but we're farther away from it than we were 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think the last 4 years have been very difficult for many, many people. There's no doubt about that. That includes immigrant communities, that includes for women. I think that we have seen, as I mentioned before, a spike in hate incidents, not just against Asian Americans, but other groups as well. I think that the question of how do we get there is that, Prop 16 is one part of the solution. It is not a panacea. There is no panacea. It requires individuals doing what they can in whatever environments they find themselves. As Rick noted, the importance of leadership is very, very important. But I think the broad question of can we be a pluralistic society and what would be the way to achieve that is on the table this election, right? And pluralism in all its facets, whether that's religion, race, gender, ethnicity. And I think in order to make that work, I have much, much, much more confidence that we can have these types of dialogues to talk about how race and gender matter, and that we do better by having those conversations than we do by saying, look, we're all going to put on blindfolds around issues of race and gender. I don't think that serves anyone. And so it is difficult, I think, for many when we see people protesting in the streets but we have to listen to what's being said. And we have to listen, and whether that's the women's movement, whether that's people of color, whether that's immigrants. I think these are real concerns that so-called colorblind policies have not addressed.
So, so if I can make a slightly complex argument, I'll try to do it quickly. But I think there are three different strands going on here. One is that there's an underlying trend towards greater tolerance and greater support for civil rights and equality. You know, there's something called the General Social Survey. That's a survey that's done by the University of Chicago nationally every year. And it's been done since the early 1970s. And the trend lines on all their questions that relate to race have shown steady improvement, progress in the ways that the three of us would like. Greater desire to have neighbors of a different race, greater support for integration in schools. And, you know, the protests this summer, ironically, I mean, at the same time, you're sort of highlighting, you're making visual to people a problem, but you're also signaling that there's broader tolerance, that there's more acceptance. The proportion of people who support Black Lives Matter increased a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. So I think that this narrative that we're becoming more racist is incorrect. I think what's driving that is that folks like Donald Trump have seized on political correctness and things where they see us kind of doing really anti-liberal things to foster a very rigid view of what diversity has to look like. And people like me and many voters feel some resonance with that message because they feel that, well, yes, this political correctness issue, for example, and this idea that diversity has to exactly match the underlying population, those are sort of overkill problems. So you get this ability to exploit things like Prop 16 to create division. So I think the trend towards tolerance is different from kind of the trend towards how people are thinking ideologically about things like political correctness. But the third trend that's very important here is that we're becoming such a multi-ethnic nation. And that, Caroline, I think really cuts against anything like Prop 16. You know, one legal difficulty Prop 16 would have if it passed is that Supreme Court has said you can't have a majority creating preferences on its own behalf. Mm-hmm. That's similar to the Croson decision I mentioned before. And we have a non-white majority in California. We have a majority just of Hispanics and Blacks. So that, you know, that not only creates legal problems, but it creates political problems. And when you're trying to implement something like racial preferences in the modern world, you've got all these issues. Well, how do we treat multiracial people? I have a son who's half Black and half white. You know, how is he treated by a system like that? You get into all sorts of really awful, messy, and unfair situations. And so race neutrality, I think, becomes an even more important principle in a highly diverse society.
How would a Prop 16, when we're looking at businesses and small businesses right now, we have a climate in California that's so reactive and going after our business community with contracting and employment. How is that going to tie into this Prop 16 question? It's easy to talk about education, and there's been so many court rulings on that already. Vincent, how do you see a Prop 16 working within the business community in California?
Well, first I would say this is like one area where clearly Prop 16 has brought people together. Prop 16 has the endorsement of the California Business Roundtable, the Chambers of Commerce, the Asia Pacific Chamber, the Hispanic Chamber, the Black Chamber, and it also has the endorsement of California Labor Federation and the Teachers Association and the Nurses Association, and on and on and on. I think when we look at contracting, we know that it's not just about those companies that might choose to do business with the state in some form or fashion, but it's also small businesses in general. One thing that happened with the federal stimulus programs, Paycheck Protection Program, which was designed to help small businesses, is that at the outset, 90% of businesses owned by people of color and women were shut out because they went through existing banks, and existing banks were allowed to prioritize their customers as they so choose. And we saw plenty of news reports and research that showed they went to the old boys network. We haven't gotten rid of that old boys network. It's still there. And so Prop 16 would allow many of the small business, minority-owned and women-owned programs that were called to come back and to figure out how we make sure that all of these small businesses can succeed. We know that in order for the overall economy to advance, we need small businesses. It cannot just be the larger corporations that can withstand something like the current economic recession that we're in. And so I think that Prop 16 would allow, again, different entities to craft narrowly tailored, constitutionally sound ways to address disparities. They first have to prove those disparities, but we know that they're there, again, as evidenced by the PPP program example that I mentioned.
So I would just make 2 points. One is, Vincent is right that California elites are overwhelmingly for Prop 16. The list of endorsements is stunning. And yet public opinion polls are showing Prop 16 trailing.
Yeah.
And I think that goes to this political dimension I was talking about before, that the average person, and I would include myself as an average person, is just wondering, why are the elites, why are they so eager to engage in racial discrimination? There's a real sense that the elites are just kind of, they're sort of lining up behind what's politically correct. They're eager to have this extra power, but we shouldn't really trust them to have that power. We don't really want that to be part of the menu of options that they have. So I think there is this real dichotomy, and it's an interesting dichotomy between how elites perceive Prop 16 and how the general voter population does. On this contracting issue, I think that's a good example of where race neutrality can make a big difference there by trying to focus on businesses that are small or that are struggling or that have been disproportionately hurt by COVID. There's no reason why a progressive state like California can't have programs to help businesses whose disadvantage is defined in those objective ways. But certainly, Black firms and Hispanic firms are not the only ones that have been adversely affected by COVID. Small firms are not uniformly women-owned. Gender and race are just not very useful categories in deciding what sort of businesses do we want to help. And there's a well-known history of problems when you have racial set-asides in contracting, where you get these companies that have some sort of nominal minority leadership, but where the real equity lies in white hands. And it's a very bad form of tokenism. And it's not, in any event, it's not going to help the folks who really need the help. I mean, the people who Black-owned and women-owned businesses, those owners are not part of the pipeline problem. Those folks are generally highly successful. There's no reason why we want to bend over backwards to help that particular group when there are so many other pipeline problems that need to be addressed and do need funding.
Vincent, one of the questions you answered, one of the questions that came in already asking about what notable groups are in favor of Prop 16. But the second part of the question that came out was asking why exactly are there so many of our Asian communities are opposed to Prop 16? Obviously, your organization is not, but there are many other groups that are. Can you explain that?
Absolutely. I think much of the concern is around higher education admissions. And I think that there's two ways that we can address that. I think the first is the issue of scarcity. That across the board, it's becoming more competitive for all groups, including Asian Americans, to be able to go to college that they feel will give them the best chance for success. So there's a heightened degree of competition. The costs have also gone up. And I think it's created an environment where many issues around college admissions are unfortunately seen as zero-sum. But I think the other thing is to note that within the Asian American community on issues of college admissions, there are a range of experiences. And that we do know the Asian American community is not just Chinese or Filipino or Southeast Asian. There's a whole range of experiences. And I think we do know that some groups are underrepresented and others are not. So I think that, in my view, we have seen that affirmative action across the board does help communities of color, including Asian Americans. But the problem with discrimination against Asian Americans, which I've devoted, pretty much my adult career to fighting discrimination against Asian Americans, requires us to use affirmative action to solve those problems. I think that it's issues of retention, it's issue of recruitment. The majority of Asian Americans are in community college. There's so many different ways that beyond just falling into the narrative of a zero sum at most of the universities. I'll just say this one thing in terms of the polling and where we're at. I have a different analysis than Rick, and I guess we'll find out in 5 days where voters actually land. But I think actually that we have a support of people who not only what you describe as elites. My father worked in New York Chinatown. I continue to work in Chinatown. I think that folks on the margins, the supporters of Black Lives Matter, founders of Black Lives Matter, are in support of Prop 16. I think we understand that affirmative action is a critical way that we can have a tool to solve these problems. I think that the pandemic has obviously created a very different campaign season, as well as the top of the ticket and all the attention being paid to that. And also 12 measures on the ballot, some of which are having over $100 million, $200 million spent on them. So we will see, but I wouldn't overread into the early polls.
Richard, I'm curious. Number one.
John, can I just comment briefly? I want to agree with Vincent. It's important that we all understand the Asian American population is that's a catch-all for a very diverse group of ethnicities.
Especially in Orange County.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Cambodian Americans have tremendous obstacles and a lot of segregation and high poverty. Japanese Americans are generally highly assimilated and a very high percentage are in the middle class. But it's also important to recognize that all those Asian American groups are internally very diverse. Not all Chinese or Korean or Japanese Americans are model minorities or success stories. There are many low-income families in all those groups, which is an important reason why using socioeconomic characteristics rather than race is so important in transcending stereotypes. Asian Americans have a lot of very concrete reason to be concerned about something like Prop 16 because the Harvard case illustrated how invidious discrimination against Asian Americans can be. Not only did Harvard, actively choose other groups over Asian Americans, but they also developed this whole personal rating system that became a way of trying to comply with civil rights laws while also undermining Asian applicants, and involved really nasty stereotyping of Asians as just another violin player or just another shy, quiet type. It was just really bad stuff, and Berkeley and UCLA are just gnashing at the bit to do the same thing that Harvard does. There was an internal study that I was able to make public through a public records request that showed UCLA was already engaging in anti-Asian discrimination, even in violation of Prop 209. So there's a lot of reason for Asian Americans to be concerned about this.
Let me just say a little bit about this because, our organization has been very involved in the Harvard case as well as the recent activities at Yale University. And I'm actually an alumni of Harvard, and so I can speak to some of this from personal experience. Harvard has a long legacy of racism. It has a long legacy of sexism. There's no doubt about it. It's a several hundred-year-old institution. And to be able to dismantle that requires us to acknowledge and address these problems. The challenge facing Asian Americans who are trying to get into Harvard or who have gone to Harvard is not to lay the blame on affirmative action. It's to lay the blame on anti-Asian discrimination. Right? So I think when we look at the experience, for example, of the Jewish American community that faced a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, the solution was to fight the anti-Semitism. It was not to decrease programs that would help women. It was not to decrease programs that would help minorities. I think similarly, we have to understand the Asian American experience as one of challenging systems that have held up power for the white dominant majority. And I think that's the work that lies ahead. I'll say also with respect to the Yale case, that's also where the Trump administration is alleging discrimination against Asian Americans. For the purposes of that action, they excluded Southeast Asians, which is a tip-off right away that something funny is going on there. And a lot of it is really designed, I think, more political motivation to try and strike down affirmative action programs than really to do anything about the challenges that Asian Americans face.
Richard, I'm curious, number one, if you think Prop 16 has a chance of passing, and a question has come in about your opinion on picking winners and losers. If you think that's kind of a way to sum up that, would that be a correct way of summing up? Do you think it's government and or businesses picking winners and losers?
I'm not sure I'm getting the winners and losers part of the question, Carolyn.
The Prop 16, do you think if Prop 16 passes that it's just government's way of picking winners and losers going forward? Do you think that's an apt definition for that? And do you think it's going to pass?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely not over. The polls, the polls are showing it trailing, but it's close enough that things can change. And the Yes campaign has many more resources than the No campaign. And a lot of people take newspapers into the polling booth with them, and the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle are endorsing Prop 16. So this race is by no means over, and it's very important that people be engaged and inform themselves and vote. In terms of the winners and losers issue, I guess how I would respond is that we have a history when we deal with racial issues to resort to things that tend to help the upper middle class. A lot of the winners from Prop 16 who are Black and Hispanic would be upper middle class Blacks and Hispanics. They're disproportionately the ones who would receive the large preferences to places like Berkeley and UCLA and UC San Diego. They're the ones who would receive the set-aside contracts. You would see less emphasis at UC, I'm sure, on socioeconomic factors in admissions, because UC right now is an outlier. Because it has this restriction on racial preferences, it's an outlier in the use of socioeconomic preferences. So you would see fewer people from low and moderate income families coming in. You'd see a smaller share of students receiving Pell Grants. So the winners would be, I think, economic elites. And I think that's another problematic difficulty with this whole strategy, is that it's not only helping the wrong folks, but it's not fixing the pipeline.
Well, it's interesting. Since Prop 209 passed in the mid-1990s, there have been multiple attempts over the decades to reverse that. At one point, it passed in both the Senate and the Assembly, and I think then Governor Brown vetoed it. So it's one of those legislative stories that I don't think will end here, especially if Prop 16 fails. So Vincent, what is the future of this? Is there this wave that the change is going to go back no matter what, and eventually the groups that are wanting to return this to law aren't going to rest? Is this going to happen in our future no matter what?
I think the issue of affirmative action is going to be with us so long as we have structural racism and systemic discrimination against women, because it continues to be the most direct and straightforward way of addressing those problems. Now, doing that in a way that doesn't overreach or overstep the bounds of our U.S. Constitution is important. And I think that those bounds have been considerably narrowed over the years. Prop 16 came about in many ways as a response to a growing awareness amongst the electorate and elected officials that something more has to be done. When Proposition 209 was passed in the mid-90s, California was a very different place. And California voters who were African-American, who were Latino and Asian Americans, all voted against Proposition 209, but it still passed. And so I think the demographics have shifted. And increasingly, I believe women of all backgrounds also know that everything from the differential in pay between them and their male counterparts, that the type of problems we have when men are overrepresented in positions of power or respect to harassment in the workplace, that it requires us to have another tool in the tool belt. Not to do away with what Rick has mentioned with respect to using socioeconomic indicators, and also a lot of other indicators as well. First-time generation, first-time college goers, English language learners. There are sorts of other ways that, of course, we experience discrimination. But I think in this country, we know that both race and gender figure prominently into people's lives and their experiences. Policymakers ought to have the ability to do something more direct about it.
Great, thank you so much. I think with that, Richard, I think we're going to let Vincent have the last word on this. I'm feeling a little bit more positive, I will say. I think there's a lot that we can do in California. I think the whole pipeline issue is something that I think Orange County as a whole really needs to look at very seriously and see what we can get on the ground and grow at least in our county here and start to move forward positively. I'd like to thank our panelists today. Vincent Pan, who's the co-executive director for Chinese for Affirmative Action, and Dr. Richard Sander, a distinguished professor of law at UCLA. Thank you so much. Thank you to our sponsors, UCI and UCI Health, for making this program possible at no cost to our viewers, which is really good. And for more information, please visit the OC Forum or any of the websites that are listed in the description section for this program and all our comments section. Thank you very much. Thank you to OC Forum for inviting me to participate in this today, and we hope to see you again very soon.